Study Session 6, International Agencies of Interstate Relations. Introduction. In this study session, you will be exposed to the relevant facts about international law. In our quest to discuss this subject, we shall begin our discourse by looking at various conceptual definitions of the term international law. We shall also explain other central issues like sources, origin, how it affects Africans, and how Africans influence it. You will also be acquainted with the general aims of international organizations and inform you about the position of Africa vis-à-vis these organizations. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to define international law, discuss why Africans must study international law, analyze how Africans perceive international law, and our role in influencing it. What is international law? Let us start this discussion by first defining law. The Encyclopedic World Dictionary defines law as 1. The principles and regulations emanating from a government and applicable to the people, whether in form of legislation or of custom and policies recognized and enforced by judicial decision. 2. Any written or positive rule or collection of rules prescribed under the authority of the state or nation, whether by the people in its constitution as the organic law, or by the legislature in its statute law, or by the treaty-making power, or by the municipalities in their ordinances or bylaws. There are three major levels of law: organizational laws made by clubs, parties, and associations, national laws made by governments or national legislatures, and international law. Of these three, national law is the most powerful. What then is international law? Stark, an authority in international law, defines it as the body of law which is composed for its greater part of the principles and rules of conduct which states feel themselves bound to observe and therefore do commonly observe in their relations with each other. It includes A. The rules of law relating to the functioning of international institutions or organizations, and B. Certain rules of law relating to individuals and non-state entities. Another authority, Whittaker, says that international law or public international law or law of nations is the system of law which governs relations among nations. We will only add here that international law is the body of principles and rules governing the relations, actions, and interactions of states in the international system. It is mainly concerned with independent states, but increasingly turning its focus also at individuals and non-national groups such as business companies. There is popular skepticism about international law. Many people argue that international law is not effective, that the laws are not obeyed by states, and that there are no enforcement agencies. Those who say that states don't observe the laws point to wars here and there, hijacking, and so on. However, there are treaties, customs regulating state behavior daily. It is only a few violations which are publicized that people hear or read about. It is like in a town where over 3,000 vehicles move about daily and 3 accidents occur. The media will announce these 3 accidents, but the other 2,997 vehicles did not have accidents. On the matter of enforcement of international law, it is true that within the state there are the police, army, customs men, and other law enforcement agencies. At the international level, there are no such bodies to enforce laws. International law is based on the consent of states, and its enforcement is based on good faith. But where necessary, states come together to enforce international law, say through sanctions or through collective security actions. Also, international public opinion often puts pressure on states to obey international law. But the strongest weapon is the act of reciprocity, that is, do me, I do you, which can also be termed reprisals. Reprisals are actions that are illegal, but they are rendered legal or justifiable by the prior illegal action of a state. In these ways and others, international law is enforced. Thus, despite the absence of enforcement agents, international law plays great role in maintaining order, peace, and security in the world. Tip: international law is the body of principles and rules governing the relations, actions, and interactions of states in the international system. It is mainly concerned with independent states, but increasingly turning its focus also at individuals and non-national groups such as business companies. Sources of international law. These include 1. Treaties made by states on economic, political, and military matters. 2. Natural law emphasizing what is right and just behavior. 3. Teachings and writings of renowned legal luminaries or publicists. 4. Judicial decisions of the International Court of Justice. 5. Customs that are internationally accepted, e.g., human rights respect, good treatment and protection of heads of state. 6. National domestic laws, national judicial systems generally acceptable. 7. General principles of law recognized by civilized nations, such as a man is innocent until he is proven guilty. The origin and development of the modern international legal system dates back to the latter part of the 16th century, and as recognized by R.P. Anand, the legal system owes its genesis and earlier growth to the interactions among Western European nations. Thus, international law has been largely European, both in character and its application. Its aims point in the same European direction. Verzigi, writing in 1955, observed, "Now there is one truth that is not open to doubt, namely that the actual body of international law as it stands today is not only the product of conscious activity of the European mind, but also drawn its vital essence from the common source of European beliefs, and in both these aspects it is mainly European in origin." African nations had not emerged when the codification of international law began. Because of the Eurocentric origin of international law, It is used as a powerful weapon by the European states against the weak and newly emergent states of Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Abi Saab wrote on this when he said, "Treaties have been used to sanctify subjugation and exploitation of the smaller and weaker states. Many newly independent states had to sign unequal treaties or to adhere to military alliances under strong pressures." International law started developing from the attempts to make rules regulating the conduct of affairs between independent communities. Laws were made on treaties, immunities of ambassadors, and wars. Such early laws existed in ancient Egypt, India, and the Greek city-states. Also, when Rome dominated the ancient world, rules guiding the relations between Rome and the various lands she ruled existed. However, Western writers argue that modern international law has European origin. Jean Bodin, a French, wrote The Theory of Sovereign State in 1576 in his De Republique. Since then, sovereignty has become a central point in international law. Hugo Grotius, a Dutch scholar, is regarded as the father of international law. He wrote 2 works on international law, De Jure Prade in 1604 and De Jure Belli Act Passis in 1625. Richard Zuch, who lived between 1590 and 1660, wrote much on international law, taking state practice as the only source of international law. It is only from the 19th century that scholars or writers outside Western Europe began to contribute towards the development of international law. The present international law is a product of the efforts of the last 400 years. It had developed as states developed. It is Eurocentrically based on the customs and practices of European states. Law changes slowly. Law is one of the most conservative aspects of human life, and of course, international law in most cases still retains the European character it got before African states emerged on the international scene. Note: while international law developed in the European world, traditional African societies had rules guiding the relationship and interaction between their various communities, but they were forcefully brought into the European scheme of things through colonial conquest and administration. As these African states became independent one after the other, they inherited treaties entered into by their former colonial masters and had to ratify many already existing treaties fashioned out again in European thinking and beliefs. Africa and international law. Why is it important that Africans should study international law? 4 major reasons can be forwarded for this. 1. It gives us insight into the sources, origin, and development of international law. 2. It enables us to assess the position of Africa in relation to the European nations with reference to matters relating to international law. 3. The political, social, and economic development or underdevelopment of Africa today is strongly tied to these laws. For instance, the agreements reached by the colonial powers in the Berlin Conference of December 1884 to January 1885 played a major role in the scramble for balkanization, colonization, and pillaging of Africa by Western European nations. 4. International law is one of the spheres of international relations where African states had clashing interests with European states in the process of interpretation and application. How do Africans perceive international law? Africans regard the present-day international law as a system of laws which has strong European origin and developed without African influence up until the 19th century. B. A weapon in the hands of European states for the exploitation, subjugation, and oppression of the weaker and newly emergent poor nations of the world. C. A system of laws needing certain changes in order to eliminate the dysfunctional aspects of the legal system, while retaining and supporting its fundamental and progressive aspects. Let us now draw your attention to the role of African states in influencing international law. International law covers many areas of international relations: treatment of aliens, use of international waters, use of the airspace, treatment of heads of state, making of treaties, making of wars, international economic relations, and so on. To reflect the role of African nations in influencing or changing international law, we shall here focus on one of these areas: the law of international economic relations, that is, expropriation. Reflection. The political, social, and economic development or underdevelopment of Africa today is strongly tied to international laws. For instance, the agreements reached by the colonial powers in the Berlin Conference of December 1884 to January 1885 played a major role in the scramble for balkanization, colonization, and pillaging of Africa by Western European nations. Law of international economic relations. Expropriation. Following the colonization and the effects of economic poverty and capital shortage in what are now the developing countries, foreigners came into these states to invest in many spheres of production: services, mining, manufacture, and automobile. Many African nations, however, later developed what Akínsànyà describes as economic nationalism. According to Akínsànyà, economic nationalism in less developed countries, often characterized by a drive to gain control over these economies or gain control over alien-owned enterprises. Initially, these foreign investments had little or no law limiting them, national or international, and the investors had free business atmosphere. However, later, international law tried to bring economic relations and nationalization and expropriation under this umbrella in the way that favored European investors. Thus, in 1952, the UN General Assembly passed Resolution 6267 on the 12th of December, acknowledging the rights of people to exploit their national resources. The resolution called for international cooperation in the exercise of these rights. It also called for restraints against all forms of acts designed to impede the exercise of the sovereignty of states over their natural resources. However, at this time, about 93% of African states were under colonial rule. Thus, the resolution was against African interests, as the sovereign states then in Africa were basically the colonial powers. Therefore, in 1954, with about 21 African and many other developing states in the United Nations Organization, pressures gave rise to the setting up of a committee of 9 to investigate, among other things, the ways of upholding the sovereignty of nations over their natural resources. Basing action on the recommendations of this committee, the General Assembly on the 12th of December 1960 adopted Resolution 1515, the 15th, stating that the sovereign right of every state to dispose of its wealth and its natural resources should be respected in conformity with the rights and duties of states under international law. With further pressures and increasing membership of African and other developing states, another resolution came up in 1962, UN General Assembly, Resolution 1802, the 17th. This resolution reinforced the inalienable rights of all states to freely dispose of their natural wealth and resources according to their national interests. In other words, the resolution held that foreign ownership of the means of production within a particular country should not prevent the state from exercising its sovereignty or its powers of economic planning. The resolution also provided that states are free to restrict or prohibit the importation of foreign capital. However, paragraph 4 of the resolution states, nationalization, expropriation, and requisitioning shall be based on grounds or reasons of public utility, security, or national interests which are recognized as overriding purely individual or private interests, both domestic or foreign. In such cases, the owner shall be paid prompt and appropriate compensation in accordance with rules in force in the state taking such measures and in accordance with international law. The provision for prompt and appropriate compensation in this resolution did not please many developing countries. Therefore, further pressures gave rise to another General Assembly resolution on the 12th of December 1974 on economic rights and duties of states, stating in Section 2C that each state has the right to nationalize, expropriate, or transfer ownership of foreign property, in which case appropriate compensations should be paid by the state adopting such measures. Removed from this latter resolution was the provision calling for mandatory payment of prompt, adequate, and effective compensation and requirement of governmental action in conformity with international law. Nationalization cases in Africa. Nationalization seems to have first occurred in the USSR after the Russian Revolution of 1917, when the new Bolshevik government nationalized banking, merchant shipping, insurance, and then the assets of Russians who fled the country. From here, nationalization spread to Latin America, Mexico, Britain, and so on. The first nationalization in Africa was in 1956, when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal and was, for this reason, invaded by Britain, France, and Israel. Other cases include Tanzania, Zambia, Uganda, Libya, and then Nigeria. In the case of Tanzania, in February 1967, the country proclaimed a socialist doctrine, Ujamaa, to end the exploitation of man by man. The government then nationalized all banking and took over some firms. However, government paid full and fair compensation as there were no legal or diplomatic disputes before the country and foreign firms or country over the action. For Uganda, Amin in 1971 expelled Asians with 90 days ultimatum and took over their property without compensation and handed these over to Ugandans. Britain made representations to Uganda to enter into formal negotiations for compensation, but Amin refused. Britain brought this up at the UN General Assembly, but no resolution was passed on it. The case would have been different if majority of the UN General Assembly were not from developing countries. These show the role of these new states, including African states, in changing the offending aspects of international law. Study session summary. In this study session, we discussed international law, a body of principles and rules governing the relations between nations. The sources of international law include treaties, natural law, judicial decisions, customs, and national domestic laws. International law originated from Europe and has essentially developed among Eurocentric orbits until the 19th century. As a result, African interests, problems, and beliefs were not taken into view while codifying international law. End of study session 6. Thanks for listening.